Marcus and Tiana thought they were buying peace. A dream home, sunshine, and safety for their little boy. But in this perfect neighborhood, horror doesn't hide in the dark, it smiles in daylight, wears khakis, and serves violation letters. What started as a white picket fence, turned into a war they never saw coming. If you think racism wears hoods and hides in shadows, think again. Sometimes, it holds a clipboard and claims it's just following the rules. Share this story if you believe homeowners' rights shouldn't depend on the color of your skin. Because silence lets power grow, but truth? Truth tears fences down. Marcus and Tiana Wilson had spent nearly a decade building toward this moment. Every overtime shift, every canceled vacation, every postponed luxury had a purpose, creating a stable life for their son, Noah. When the email came through confirming their mortgage approval, Tiana cried. Not from stress, not from worry, but from joy. They were finally homeowners. Not just anywhere, but in a serene, gated community just outside Orlando, where streets curved around manicured lawns and kids rode scooters on sidewalks lined with palm trees. The house itself wasn't extravagant, but it was perfect for them. A single-story, 3-bedroom ranch with beige siding, wide windows, and a backyard that caught the morning sun. More than anything, it was safe. Safe from the noise of the city, safe from the sirens and stray bullets they'd grown used to in their old apartment complex, safe from the fear that someone might mistake Marcus walking late from the car for a threat. Neighbors waved as they moved in. Some offered smiles and cookies. A middle-aged woman across the street brought a potted plant with a note that said, "Welcome to the neighborhood." For the first time in a long time, Tiana allowed herself to believe they belonged. Not just here, but in this version of America, the one that promised fairness if you worked hard enough. Noah, barely 3 years old, ran through the empty house giggling as boxes stacked up. He kept gravitating toward the backyard, thrilled by the open space. That's when Marcus decided they'd need a fence. The yard backed up to a small drainage canal. It wasn't dangerous, but it wasn't safe either, not for a toddler who could vanish behind a bush in seconds. So, they applied for a simple white picket fence, clean, classic, and just like the one several other houses had up and down the block. Marcus filled out the HOA request form just as the welcome binder instructed. He attached photos, a diagram, and even confirmed the paint color with the local hardware store. A week later, they got the green light. Approval granted. Construction began the next day, and within 72 hours, the fence was complete. Neat, bright, and beautiful, it framed their little corner of happiness like a picture. They couldn't have known then how quickly that picture would start to crack. The first clue came subtly. A passing neighbor, a man in his 60s wearing golf attire, paused in front of their new fence and stared longer than seemed necessary. When Marcus greeted him, the man nodded stiffly and walked on. The next morning, there was a sticky note on their mailbox. It wasn't signed, just a scrawl, not in compliance with visual standards. Check your manual. Tiana brushed it off as a misunderstanding. She reread the HOA manual, then double-checked their approval letter. Everything was in order. Maybe someone was just confused, she reasoned. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The smiles from some neighbors started fading. One woman who had previously offered Noah a juice box now avoided eye contact. Then, 5 days after the fence was completed, an envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the HOA. Inside was a formal letter stating their property was in violation of Rule 4.6, Aesthetic Harmony, and they had 10 days to remove the fence or face escalating fines. Attached was a blurry photo of their own backyard. Tiana stared at the letter in disbelief. The exact same style of fence stood proudly in at least 3 other yards on their street. Marcus tried calling the HOA office but was routed to voicemail. He left a message and sent a follow-up email, attaching all their documents, the approval letter, photos, the original form. He even printed a copy and dropped it off at the clubhouse in person. For days, they heard nothing. Then, another letter arrived. This one was firmer. A $150 fine had been applied to their account. A second offense could double it. A third could result in a lien on their property. The threat felt disproportionate, almost surreal. They began noticing small changes during the day. Cars slowing down as they drove past. Someone lingering at the corner with a smartphone pointed toward their home. A neighbor who used to wave now turned their back. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was something else. Something colder. Something quiet. Marcus stood in his backyard one afternoon, watching Noah chase bubbles under the blue sky, framed perfectly by the fence he had proudly installed. He felt a strange heaviness in his chest. The kind that didn't come from paperwork or rules, but from being watched, judged, and quietly unwelcome in a place he'd thought was home. What they hadn't realized yet was that this wasn't just about property lines or design rules. It was about control. About who gets to belong. And in this neighborhood, even a picket fence had power and consequences. The second letter arrived just a week after the first, sealed in the same crisp envelope, stamped with the HOA's insignia, a tree-lined street inside a perfect circle. This time, the tone was harsher. There was no greeting, no acknowledgement of their prior response. Just a bold subject line, second notice, non-compliance with community standards. Below it, the letter listed the same infraction, unauthorized modification to property boundaries resulting in visual disharmony. The language had shifted. It was no longer about the fence being unapproved, but about it disturbing the aesthetic flow of the neighborhood. The fine had increased to $300. A due date was printed at the bottom in red ink. If unpaid, further action could include legal fees and suspension of community privileges. The letter concluded with a warning that non-payment could eventually lead to a property lien. Marcus read the line twice, then handed the paper to Tiana with trembling hands. She read it silently, jaw tight, eyes narrowing at the phrase, visual disharmony. It echoed the same coded language they'd heard before in corporate spaces, rental applications, even neighborhood conversations, the kind that didn't say the word race, but left it hanging just beneath the surface. The absurdity of it all made their heads spin. The fence was the same white picket design as the others. Same height, same material. If anything, theirs was cleaner, newer, more carefully maintained. They drove through the neighborhood again just to be sure. 3 other homes had identical fences. None of them had been fined. None had received notices. All of them belonged to white families. Marcus returned to the HOA office during daytime hours, but no one answered the door. A sign on the glass read, "By appointment only." He emailed again, called twice more, even left a letter in the drop box outlining their approval and pointing out the inconsistency with other properties. Still, no reply. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's friendliness continued to decay. A couple who had once offered to watch Noah during the move now crossed the street to avoid conversation. An older man on a bike stopped at the edge of their driveway one morning, stared at the fence, shook his head, and pedaled away. It wasn't overt hostility, but it was clear enough. The shift wasn't accidental. One afternoon, Tiana was walking Noah when she passed a woman on her porch 2 houses down. The woman had smiled during their first week. This time, her expression was flat. Tiana waved out of habit. The woman nodded, then said quietly, "The HOA takes the rules seriously around here. It's nothing personal." The words stung more than they should have. Because they were personal. Every mailbox, every lawn, every porch in that neighborhood was personal. That was the point of communities like this, where everything looked the same, everyone acted the same, and any difference felt like an offense. Marcus started taking photos of other fences, porches, even Halloween decorations left out weeks past the holiday. Some properties had garden gnomes, multicolored mailbox flags, even unauthorized additions to landscaping. No violation letters. No escalating fines. No threats. Just their fence. He compiled the photos into a document and printed them with side-by-side comparisons to their own fence. He included timestamps, addresses, even highlighted the section in the HOA manual where it said that decorative fences under 4 feet in height were generally permitted, pending written approval. They had that approval. They decided to attend the upcoming HOA board meeting. It was held once a month in the community clubhouse on Saturday mornings. The agenda posted online didn't mention individual violations, but there was an open floor period at the end. They prepared a folder with every document, email, and photo. That Saturday, they arrived early, dressed professionally, folder in hand. The room was filled with about 20 people, most of them older, all of them white. The board sat at a long table with microphones. When Marcus raised his hand during the open floor, he was acknowledged, but only allowed 3 minutes to speak. He explained the timeline, showed their documents, politely noted the inconsistency in enforcement. One of the board members, a man in a polo shirt and khakis, leaned back in his chair and asked flatly, "Are you saying we're targeting you?" Marcus responded carefully, "I'm saying the rules don't seem to be applied equally." Another member interjected, "We receive a high volume of complaints. This isn't about targeting. It's about maintaining the community's integrity." Tiana asked if any other homeowners with similar fences had received notices. The room went quiet. A third board member looked at his papers and said, "That's confidential information. We can't disclose other residents' violations." The meeting moved on without further discussion. No resolution, no acknowledgement of the approval letter, no retraction of the fine. They were left with silence, and a room full of eyes that didn't want to meet theirs. By the time they returned home, another envelope was waiting on their doorstep. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a printed photo of their fence, circled in red marker, with the words "still non-compliant" written in block letters across the top. The message was clear now. This wasn't about a fence. This was about presence. About being seen in a place where they weren't expected to stay. The fence wasn't the problem, it was the excuse. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow moving just out of sight. A parked SUV that didn't belong on their street sat idling for hours, windows tinted too dark to see inside. A drone buzzed overhead twice in one afternoon, low enough for its camera to be visible. At first, Marcus thought he was imagining things. Tiana wasn't so sure. But then the pattern emerged, the same car circling the block during the day, the same drone appearing like clockwork between noon and 2. At first, they tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the neighborhood had tech-savvy kids, or a curious neighbor with too much time on their hands. But that hope vanished quickly. Every time they brought Noah into the backyard, the drone appeared. Every time Marcus opened the garage to mow the lawn or load groceries, the SUV crept by, slowing just long enough to feel deliberate. The feeling of being watched began to sink into their bones. Tiana started drawing the curtains during daylight hours. She stopped letting Noah play in the backyard, afraid someone was filming him. Marcus moved his workout routine inside, abandoning the front porch altogether. Their home, once a sanctuary, felt more like a glass box. Things escalated further when they discovered a small paper taped to their back gate. It had no note, just a printed copy of their original fence approval, stamped, rescinded, in red ink. No date, no signature. Just that single word. The implication was chilling. Someone had gone into their backyard. Someone had crossed the line between policy and intimidation. They called the police, hoping to file a trespassing report. The responding officer listened carefully, nodded sympathetically, then casually asked if they were sure the paper hadn't blown in from somewhere else. When Marcus showed him the gate, where the paper had been taped with 2 strips of clear packing tape, the officer shrugged. "Unfortunately, without camera footage, there's not much we can do," he said. He didn't even take a statement. So they bought cameras, 4 of them. 1 for the front porch, 2 for the side yards, and 1 overlooking the backyard. That night, they installed them in silence. Noah asked why Daddy was putting robots on the roof. Tiana told him they were helpers, to protect the house. She didn't have the heart to say what they were really afraid of. The next morning, one of the cameras had been ripped down. Not broken. Removed cleanly from the mount, like someone knew exactly how to disable it. There was no footage saved, no trace of who had done it. But the message was unmistakable: "We see you. We can reach you." They began receiving anonymous letters in their mailbox, unstamped, hand-delivered. Each one was more unsettling than the last. One quoted the HOA handbook line by line. Another included a photo of Marcus parking slightly over the sidewalk, a supposed violation. One was simply a picture of Noah playing in the front yard, with the words, "Community Safety First," typed in bold underneath. Marcus and Tiana began keeping a log of every incident. Every time the drone appeared. Every time the SUV passed. Every letter. Every violation notice. They built a file, not for the HOA, but for their own protection. They even consulted an attorney, who reviewed their documents and confirmed what they already suspected: the fence fine had no legal foundation. The approval had been granted. The rescinded letter held no authority. But the real problem, the lawyer said, was proving motive. "Unless they put it in writing," he said, "you're fighting shadows." That was the worst part of it. The silence. The way no one said what they meant, yet everything was meant. The way neighbors who used to smile now looked through them. The way people walked their dogs across the street instead of passing their yard. The way a community built on rules could twist those rules into weapons. Tiana found herself jumping at every knock on the door, every shuffle on the porch. She stopped opening packages unless Marcus was home. She began looking over her shoulder even while walking to the mailbox. When she called the HOA office again, she got the same voicemail greeting, cheerful, robotic, and empty. The daylight, once full of promise, now felt like exposure. The very hours meant for peace and comfort had turned against them. Their home had become a spotlight, and they were the unwilling stars of a show no one had agreed to be part of. They thought the camera footage might help. But when they checked it, day after day, the videos were always the same: cars slowing down, someone loitering at the sidewalk, mailboxes being checked twice by strangers, kids being ushered past their driveway by parents pretending not to look. Everyone watching. No one speaking. What Marcus and Tiana didn't know was that the HOA had already held a closed meeting. Their name had been discussed. Not because they broke any rule, but because they challenged one. They asked questions. They didn't leave quietly. And that, more than anything, had made them a problem. The letter arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered not by mail but slid under their front door. It was printed on HOA letterhead but had no envelope, no postage, and no signature. The heading read, "Final Notice, Legal Escalation Imminent." It was the most aggressive document they'd received yet. The opening line accused them of willful defiance of community ordinances, followed by a list of alleged violations, many of which they'd never seen before. Unauthorized fencing was still at the top, but now there were new charges: improper lawn edging, unsanctioned security equipment, and a fabricated clause called visual disruption to community harmony. They read it over twice. It claimed that their actions had incited neighbor complaints, caused undue stress to fellow residents, and disrupted the HOA's mission of peace and order. It warned of a pending lien against their home, and that legal counsel had been retained on behalf of the board to pursue compliance through civil court if necessary. It ended with a chilling line: "You have 10 days to bring your property into full alignment or face court-imposed penalties, including possible foreclosure proceedings in accordance with Article 14, Section D." Marcus and Tiana were stunned. Foreclosure? For a fence and some cameras? The escalation wasn't just disproportionate, it was terrifying. Tiana immediately contacted the lawyer they'd spoken with weeks earlier. He reviewed the letter and confirmed what they feared: while the HOA's claims were flimsy, the threat of legal action was real. And fighting it in court would cost thousands. He told them that HOAs could exploit vague bylaws and procedural loopholes to apply pressure, especially when homeowners didn't have the means to respond quickly. He'd seen it before. Most families folded, paid the fines, took the fence down, removed the cameras. And even when they won, the psychological toll left scars that didn't fade. Marcus and Tiana weren't wealthy. Every dollar had gone into their down payment and renovations. Noah's daycare wasn't cheap. They couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle, not without sacrificing something vital. But giving in meant conceding to a power that had clearly overstepped. The next day, they received an email from a woman named Carol Simmons, someone Marcus didn't recognize. She introduced herself as a concerned member of the HOA and said she wanted to help de-escalate tensions. She suggested they agree to a mediation meeting with selected board members, where a compromise could be reached privately to avoid further conflict. Tiana read the email twice and shook her head. It wasn't mediation, it was a trap. The board wanted submission, not resolution. They wanted Marcus and Tiana to back down publicly so the rest of the neighborhood could breathe easier. The implication was clear: you're not welcome unless you follow our unspoken rules. That weekend, their lawn was vandalized. Someone poured bleach along the flower bed, killing the rose bushes Tiana had spent weeks planting. A camera caught the figure in a hoodie doing it just after midnight. But the footage was grainy, and the face was never visible. When they reported it to the police, they were told again that nothing could be done unless the suspect could be identified. Their home, once a place of comfort, was now surrounded by invisible threats. Every knock on the door made them pause. Every car slowing on the street sent a ripple of anxiety. Tiana started waking up at 3 a.m. to check on Noah. Marcus began sleeping on the couch, facing the front windows. But the retaliation didn't stop at threats or sabotage. Word began to spread online. A neighborhood Facebook group they weren't part of started circulating false claims: that their fence was built without permits, that they'd cursed at a board member, that they'd threatened legal action against neighbors. None of it was true, but none of it mattered. The social isolation deepened. Parents stopped acknowledging them at school pickups. A local handyman canceled a scheduled job without explanation. The mail began arriving later each day, often bent or missing altogether. Someone posted a photo of their home on Nextdoor with the caption, "Why can't some people just follow the rules?" They weren't just being pressured, they were being erased. Rewritten as troublemakers, outsiders, dangerous disruptors of suburban peace. It didn't matter that they had followed every rule, documented every step, or acted in good faith. The moment they pushed back, they had violated something more powerful than a bylaw. They had challenged control. Tiana began writing everything down: dates, times, incidents. A journal of harassment. She wasn't sure what it would be used for yet, but she refused to let their truth disappear. Marcus called the attorney again and asked about media options. If legal routes wouldn't protect them, maybe public exposure would. They hadn't come to the neighborhood to fight. But the fight had come to them. And now, with a retaliatory letter threatening to take their home, they realized it was no longer just about offense or even discrimination, it was about power. The quiet kind that operated behind smiles and bylaws. The kind that didn't need to shout, because it had the money, the system, and the silence of everyone else. And that kind of power didn't retreat unless it was dragged into the light. The 10th day arrived, the one marked in bold on the retaliation letter. No lawsuit had been filed yet, but a new notice appeared on their garage door. It was laminated and nailed directly into the wood. This one claimed the property was now in violation of active community lien protocols and warned of pending legal enforcement and HOA-authorized remediation. The implication was terrifying. If they didn't comply, someone might show up and start tearing things down themselves. The notice stayed up for hours, visible to every neighbor who passed. By evening, it had been photographed and reposted online, along with more comments accusing Marcus and Tiana of causing drama and refusing to respect the neighborhood standard. The mob mentality had fully taken hold, and not a single neighbor stepped forward to ask what was really happening. Not one. The silence from the community was worse than the letters. People who had once waved, smiled, or chatted in the driveway now crossed the street to avoid them. One mother clutched her child's hand tighter when passing their house, as if proximity alone posed a threat. It was no longer just about HOA power, it had become social punishment, a ritual of exclusion wrapped in rules. That night, Marcus reached a breaking point. After putting Noah to bed, he stood in the backyard and stared at the fence that had started it all. Perfectly built, fully approved, and yet somehow the spark that ignited a campaign of fear. He realized then that the fence wasn't the issue, it never had been. It was just a pretext. A way to target them for being different, for not conforming, for not knowing their place. Tiana was feeling the weight too. She began questioning whether they should have just backed down earlier, taken the fence down, apologized even if they'd done nothing wrong. But deep down, she knew surrender wouldn't have made them safe. It would have made them vulnerable. Once you proved you could be bullied, it never stopped. She'd seen it before, just not in a neighborhood wrapped in landscaping and smiling yard signs. That same week, they received a certified letter from a law firm representing the HOA. It outlined the formal intent to place a lien on their home for failure to comply with the new compliance demands. The fine had now increased to $6,200. The letter included veiled language that hinted at forced asset seizure and court-ordered intervention if they did not pay or remove the non-conforming structures. The stress began to show. Marcus started losing sleep, waking up drenched in sweat with the sound of Imagine knocking echoing in his ears. Tiana had trouble focusing at work, jumping every time her phone buzzed. Noah became clingier, asking questions about why mommy and daddy always looked so serious. The weight of constant fear was reshaping their lives. One morning, they found a strange truck parked across from their house. It was unmarked but equipped with tools and construction equipment. When Marcus approached it, the driver refused to roll down the window. The truck disappeared 15 minutes later, but not before several photos were taken, of the yard, the fence, even the security camera mounts. It was clear now that the HOA wasn't just threatening enforcement, they were preparing for it. In desperation, Marcus called a local news station. He told them everything, the letters, the surveillance, the threats, the retaliation. He sent them copies of the documents, the timestamps, the photos, and the video footage. At first, the producer was polite but hesitant. Then something shifted. She called him back within a day, her tone sharper, more urgent. She had started digging. What she found changed everything. The HOA president, Barry Feldman, wasn't just a volunteer. He owned a security contracting firm that had been paid thousands in consulting fees by the HOA over the last 3 years. He also held quiet investments in a landscaping company that had received multiple HOA maintenance contracts, some without public bidding. And he had previously been involved in a civil suit regarding misuse of funds in a different neighborhood, a case that was sealed after a private settlement. This wasn't just about control, it was about corruption. And Marcus and Tiana had become the test case, the example to scare everyone else into silence. They had felt alone for weeks, but suddenly, they had leverage. Proof. A narrative that couldn't be ignored. The news station agreed to run the story under the working title, HOA or Harassment. The Family Who Fought Back. For the first time in weeks, Tiana allowed herself to hope. Not because the fight was over, but because someone was finally listening. They printed copies of every document they had and sent them to the journalist. They gave her full access to their footage, the harassing letters, and even the audio recordings from their doorbell camera. If the HOA wanted a public reckoning, then that's exactly what they would get. But they also knew there would be a price. Retaliation never ends quietly. And the moment they exposed the truth, the people hiding behind bylaws and landscaping standards would strike back harder than ever. Still, they were ready. Because once you've been broken down to nothing, once you've lived through the fear, the silence, and the isolation, there's a freedom in finally standing up and refusing to be small anymore. The news story aired on a Monday morning. It began with aerial footage of the quiet, pristine neighborhood and the familiar cul-de-sac where Marcus and Tiana lived. The anchor's voice laid out the allegations: misuse of HOA power, hidden financial conflicts of interest, a pattern of harassment, and threats of foreclosure over a legally approved fence. Their story was framed not as an isolated dispute, but as a larger warning about unchecked authority in homeowner associations across the country. Within hours, everything changed. Neighbors who had avoided them for weeks were suddenly watching from behind blinds. Some began sending private messages: "I didn't know it was that serious," or "I'm so sorry, I should have said something." Others tried to distance themselves from the HOA board altogether. But a few, especially the most vocal enforcers, doubled down. They accused Marcus and Tiana of smearing the community and bringing shame on good people. The division was complete. The facade of harmony was shattered. The HOA board released a statement through their attorney calling the report sensationalized and misleading, insisting all actions were within the scope of their authority. But the damage was done. People started talking. Other residents quietly came forward, some anonymously, with their own stories of unfair citations, manipulative fines, and fear of retaliation. A broader pattern was emerging. 2 days later, an investigative follow-up revealed financial irregularities in HOA vendor contracts, many of which benefited board members or their relatives. A records request showed that certain enforcement actions had been selectively applied. Homes owned by newer, younger, or minority residents were cited more frequently and penalized more severely. The implication was no longer subtle, it was systemic. A local city council member weighed in, stating that while HOAs are private entities, patterns of discriminatory enforcement could trigger state-level investigations. The whispers grew louder. Someone started a petition calling for the resignation of the entire HOA board. It gained over 300 signatures in 48 hours. The pressure was mounting. Marcus and Tiana watched the chaos unfold with a mix of vindication and exhaustion. They hadn't asked for a spotlight. They had simply asked to live in peace. But now that the truth was out, there was no going back. Every message of support came with a reminder of how fragile normalcy had been. They weren't heroes, they were survivors of a war they never wanted. Then came the letter from the HOA's legal team. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a retreat. The letter stated that the lien had been lifted, all fines waived, and the board would reevaluate enforcement protocols moving forward. It also noted that the HOA president, Barry Feldman, had resigned for personal reasons, and that an emergency election would be held within 30 days. The tone was conciliatory, even apologetic. But there was no mention of the trauma, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no offer to make it right. For Marcus and Tiana, it wasn't enough. They contacted the journalist again and agreed to a live interview. In it, they spoke not just of their story, but of the silent struggles so many families face under the guise of neighborhood management. They emphasized the danger of unaccountable power and the emotional toll of weaponized bureaucracy. Their message was clear: if it happened to them, it could happen to anyone. That interview went viral. National outlets picked it up. Advocacy groups reached out, offering legal support and legislative pressure to rein in abusive HOA practices. One state senator proposed a bill that would mandate third-party audits of all large HOAs and establish penalties for discriminatory enforcement. The momentum was real. Change was coming, not just to their neighborhood, but to the system that had allowed such abuse to flourish in the first place. Back in the cul-de-sac, things grew quiet. The same people who once reported them for trivial violations now looked away when they walked by. Some offered weak smiles. Others said nothing at all. The fence still stood, untouched. The cameras still watched. But now, they watched with a different purpose, not out of fear, but as a reminder of what it had cost to protect a simple truth. Tiana kept the retaliation letters in a folder, each one labeled by date. Not as a trophy, but as a record. A history. A warning. Marcus had the news footage saved on multiple drives. Not for show, but for defense. Just in case the next board tried to erase the past. Their home, once a symbol of anxiety and exclusion, was now a quiet fortress. Not because it was protected by walls, but because it had been defended by truth, resilience, and the decision to speak when silence was easier. They didn't win in a courtroom. They won in the open, under the weight of exposure and the undeniable power of being seen. And in a world where rules can be twisted and power can hide behind polite smiles, sometimes the most radical act is refusing to be invisible. In a world where power often hides behind paperwork, where silence is mistaken for obedience, and where community can turn into control, one family's courage exposed the truth hiding in plain sight. If you think this can't happen in your neighborhood, think again. Homeowners associations are supposed to protect communities. But when they become unchecked and unaccountable, they can destroy the very lives they claim to serve. So ask yourself, would you speak up before it's too late? Or would you stay quiet until the nightmare knocks on your own front door? Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, sometimes the fight isn't about winning, it's about being seen, about standing your ground, and making sure no one else suffers in silence.